Jets fans, relax. Relax about the Aaron Rodgers news. Relax about free agency so far. I'll explain why you should relax today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, March 13th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Well, let me begin the show by telling every Jets fan out there to relax because there was some news that broke yesterday about Aaron Rodgers, and I'm not making this up. Apparently, there's talk he may run for vice president of the United States, and if he does that, then obviously he probably would not be playing for the Jets in 2024. The Jets continue to pile on the weird story, so now the fan base is freaking out. It's also been a relatively slow start to free agency for the New York Jets, so that also has the fan base concerned. So let's address this right now. Now, as always, I can never give you a 100% guarantee that everything's going to be okay. I certainly can't guarantee you free agency is going to be okay. But with Rodgers, if you've been paying attention to how he's handled off seasons over the last couple of years, this goes back to his last couple of year off seasons in Green Bay. He always turns the offseason into a soap opera. I mean, this is a guy who used Jeopardy to turn the offseason into a soap opera a few years ago. I am 95% sure this is how it's going to play out. Now, he notably did not come out. He easily could have put this stuff to an end yesterday by sending out a tweet saying, my focus is on winning a Super Bowl with the Jets this year. He didn't do that. And the reason he didn't do that is, as we all know, he may be a great quarterback, but he loves the attention. He loves the spotlight. He sucks up a lot of oxygen in any room he's in. Didn't play at all this year. Played 4 snaps. Yet the talk about around the team was mostly about, is he coming back, when that never had a chance of coming. Rodgers likes being the center of attention. That's why he did not immediately dismiss this yesterday. Would have been easy to put out a social media post. He likes being the center of attention. 95% chance of what happens here, because this is what happens with him every single time some controversy begins. He'll let this linger for a little bit so that it gets more and more attention. And then he'll come out, he'll laugh, he'll say, I can't believe anybody thought this was true. He'll mock the idea that it ever happened. That's just the way he is. And something, if you're surprised by this, you should not have, you haven't been paying attention. And if the Jets are surprised and shocked by this, well, they shouldn't have been. So I don't want to go on too long about this, because that's what's going to happen. That's 95% chance of happening. This is just going to be something that doesn't play out at all. Something that's done and everybody freaks out, and then Rodgers is going to come back next year. So relax. More significant to the New York Jets right now, I think, because free agency is happening. The Rodgers thing is just really a weird distraction. Free agency is going on right now. The Jets have gotten off to a slow start. The first day, not a lot of activity from the Jets. They re-signed their kicker, Greg Zuerlein. They made a couple small signings. They made another small signing yesterday. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the Jets at this point have not really addressed their core needs. They have not addressed wide receiver. They have not addressed the offensive line, aside from signing John Simpson from Baltimore. And many Jets fans are panicked over this. And I'm going to say something that I say many times. The offseason is not won the first day. The offseason is not won the second day. In fact, the offseason is frequently lost on those days because, and we've seen this over and over with the Jets, the first couple days are when the dumb money is spent. And I know people don't want to hear this. I know people want to see the Jets make big moves. And yet, look, there are a few moves out there I wish the Jets had made. The trade for Jerry Jeudy would have been an acceptable move over the weekend. The trade Carolina just made for Deontay Johnson, Pittsburgh wide receiver. That's another one I look at. I say, maybe the Jets could have pulled that one off. There are a couple of moves the Jets have made, of the signings they've made, that looking a little shaky. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But the smart money in the offseason is not spent the first couple of days. And it's difficult, people always ask, like, which players do you want to see the Jets sign? And of course, I can give you guys who would be good stylistic fits with the Jets. And there are guys I can like estimate. Maybe the market's not going to be so robust for them. But the fact of the matter is, we don't really know who the market's going to fall out for. The guys who are the really good values in free agency are players who tend to like overplay their hand. Good players who, seek too much money and then suddenly the market falls out for them and they have to settle for a cheap deal. The other guys who are good fits are guys who are ascending players, guys who like, maybe are on the rise, but the rest of the league hasn't really figured them out yet. And sometimes they settle for deals that are less than what they're looking for. So I think that the Jets, I don't really have a big issue with how the Jets are playing it so far. I know the fan base is freaking out. Look, I've made a few jokes about it on my website, but it's not, the offseason still has a long way to go. And there's still a lot of good players available. I mean, a lot of the good offensive linemen and wide receivers haven't signed with a new team yet. So there's still plenty of time for this situation to work itself out. Let's look at some of the day one, day two signings the Jets have made in free agency through the years. I mean, we can just go to Joe Douglas, and Joe Douglas has not been anywhere near as fiscally irresponsible with the contracts as Mike McCagnon was. But Joe Douglas, you look at some of the deals he's given out in the first couple of days of free agency. I mean, there was 2021, Corey Davis, Carl Lawson, Jared Davis, Laken Tomlinson in 2022. That was a pretty bad move. Last year, Alan Lazard. I think I'd be more upset if Douglas was, giving out extreme overpays the way he's tended to do the first couple of days in free agency. My fear heading into this offseason was Douglas was just going to torch the future, that he was just going to, sign a bunch of expensive guys to try and save his job and push a bunch of dead money to the future. I'm kind of happy he hasn't done that. I was genuinely concerned the opposite would happen. Now, look, he's got to go out and hit on some signings. The issue with Joe Douglas, more than anything, is that he has not found the value guys. Is that the guys he thinks are value guys in the past have not been value guys. They've been guys who just have not stepped up in any way. So Douglas has to do a much better examining those players. But every offseason, you'll hear about the teams that get a lot of hype, and those are usually the teams that spend big the first couple of days of free agency. You'll see some list on NFL.com of the winners, and usually it's proportional to how much money the team spends. And part of that is due because content creators need to create content, and signing big name players gives them good content. Part of it's that a lot of the under the radar guys aren't as well known, and that's part of the reason they sign better deals, is that they don't have the name recognition that the big names in the free agent market do. I can't sit here and guarantee you that the Jets are going to nail free agency, because that's simply not something that we know at this point. You just sitting out the first couple of days of free agency does not guarantee success, and I'm not suggesting it does. And I'm not suggesting that the Jets are guaranteed to do a great job this offseason, because they're not. But what I am saying is that it's too early to say that. I'm saying it's too early to render final judgment on that, because there's still a lot of time to go. So I encourage you, when it comes to this Aaron Rodgers story, relax. I think Rodgers' history speaks for itself. He likes to play up the idea that he's leaving, and then he doesn't leave. When it comes to free agency, that's a little bit dicier because Douglas doesn't have a great track record. If you want to say, John, I don't trust Douglas, I find it tough to argue with that, but we still need more time. For me, it's always a situation in the NFL where I don't panic until I'm given a reason to panic, and I do not yet have a reason to panic. There are a couple of deals the Jets have passed up on that I think may have made sense, but I still feel like there's time, that maybe there's a bigger plan behind the scenes, or at least we can hope. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to some of the players the Jets have signed. We now have some dollar figures on some guys they brought in. There's also a new member of the New York Jets. We'll get into that as we continue on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? Of course, on Sunday, we actually lost an hour because it was spring ahead. But we all know that a lot of us spend our times wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters and do more of it. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. We started to get some contract details yesterday on some of the guys the Jets signed on the first day of free agency. And it's funny because I did 2 shows yesterday, but I spent the second show talking about some of the signings the Jets made. And I told you the guy the Jets signed to play guard, John Simpson, had a contract that was relatively unfavorable, and I was assuming that the defensive tackle they signed, former San Francisco 49er Javon Kinlaw, got a reasonable contract because he was a first-round pick who really did not perform anywhere near first-round status. And what's come out since then is the Simpson deal is actually a little bit more favorable than we thought it would be, and the Kinlaw deal's less favorable than we thought it would be. So Simpson was first reported that it was a 2-year contract for up to $18 million. Up to is the operative phrase there, because up to suggests like that's the maximum value if he hits all of his incentives. And sometimes what happens in free agency is these deals are reported like that, and it's really an inflated value because that's not the guaranteed money. That's just if like everything goes perfectly for the player. And if you ever hear a situation like that, it usually means that the reporter got it from the agent, because it's the agent's incentive to make it sound like he got as big of a deal as possible for his client, because that's the agent's job. The actual deal is more along the lines of 2 years, $12 million. So we go from $9 million a year to $6 million. And if Kinlaw hits his incentives, it's probably going to be not Kinlaw. I'm sorry. If Simpson hits his incentives, he's probably going to be worth $9 million a year. I talking on the show yesterday, and I was kind of down on this signing, and I've thought about it a little bit, and I think some of the stuff I said is accurate. I do feel like this is kind of a upside play. This is a guy who was okay last year with Baltimore, but really I think performed at the level of a lower level type starter on the offensive line. And I don't love the Jets coaching staff. If you're trying to get an upside guy, I wish Keith Carter was not our position coach on the offensive line. But giving it some thought, some of the things I've been saying, what are the types of players I want to see the Jets sign in free agency? Well, I want to see the Jets sign guys in their mid-20s, guys getting their second contract. I want to see guys with a clear upward trajectory. And I want to see guys who maybe have value that the rest of the league has not picked up on. And after thinking this through yesterday, so let's give the glasses half full case on Simpson. This is a guy who was playing on a reserve futures contract a year ago. He was signed it's known as a reserve futures contract. Essentially, the guy's not on your team, and you're just signing him ahead of time. Essentially, the guys unsigned at the end of the season, so you're signing him for a future year. And these are guys who are not on a 53-man roster. He then became a starter for the number 1 seed in the AFC, and was not a disaster. May have been a low-level starter, but was not a guy who was unplayable by any stretch of the imagination. That's a pretty nice trajectory. I think you actually have to kind of like the trajectory Simpson is on, because that's vast improvement to go from guy who's was let go by the Raiders, the team that originally drafted him, guy who nobody really wanted. Suddenly he's winning a starting job on the offensive line for a good team. That's a good trajectory. That's the type of path you want to see a guy have. And if he continues on that, that's the glasses half full case for the New York Jets. Now, you're going back to what I said a little bit earlier. If you want to say I don't really trust Joe Douglas to be able to evaluate these offensive linemen, again, I can't argue with that. And Douglas has also made a career of missing in free agency on guys who he thought were high upside plays. So fair point if you want to argue that as the rebuttal. But after thinking this through, I did come up with kind of like the boom scenario for Simpson. And it's actually pretty realistic. So, I wanted to address that because, I feel like yesterday I was a little bit more dismissive of Simpson than I should have been. It's up in the air whether or not this is going to work. We can't say for sure, but I can at least understand the optimism the Jets may have for this player, because it is clear that he is improving, and you hope that if he continues to improve, then this could end up being a good signing. Now, on the other hand, Javon Kinlaw, I figured the Jets were giving him a cheap deal because he was a guy I figured would be a part-time player. He's getting almost $7 million guaranteed. That makes me wonder whether he's actually a part-time player. Maybe they view him as a full-time starter next to Quinnen Williams. And that could change my evaluation of the signing in a negative way, because Kinlaw last year was a productive pass rusher, but not a guy who looked like a full-time player. I mean, look, this was a guy who looked like a quality starter at the defensive tackle position, he'd still be in San Francisco. They would have picked up his 5th-year option. This is a guy who was a disappointment. And, if he was like a 4th-round pick, I feel like you'd be pretty happy with him. Because he'd be a part-time player, be a rotational guy. There was a lot of speculation he'd be Quentin Jefferson's replacement. And I like the idea of that because, again, this is a guy who's been a relatively productive pass rusher and who's younger. The Jets getting a little youth in their free agent signings, which is something I've wanted to see. But $7 million is a lot for a part-time player. And I don't love this signing as much as if he's going to be a full-time defensive end next to Quinnen. That could be the case where the Jets think they can unlock something in him. Saleh did coach him his rookie year, and the Jets do have some degree of credibility and non-Bryce Huff players when it comes to the defensive line. But a move I feel less enthusiasm about than I did 24 hours ago because I looked at that because we got the contract details. Also, the Jets signed another defensive tackle yesterday, Leki Fatu from Arizona, 4-year player, kind of a nose tackle kind of dude. He's going to kind of, if you remember Al Woods, the Jets signed him to kind of be a run stuffer on the interior. He's going to have that kind of role with the Jets. Woods was not going to come back after injuring his Achilles in the win against the Giants. Woods is one of the oldest defensive tackles in the NFL, and after he suffers an Achilles, there was very little chance the Jets were going to retain him. So Jets add another defensive tackle. And you may be wondering, you may be saying, well, defensive line's a strength. Why did the Jets keep signing these defensive tackles? Very simple reason. All the Jets defensive tackles, aside from Quinnen Williams, were free agents. So defensive tackle was not a need from a quality standpoint. It's not like wide receiver or offensive line where the Jets are really bad here and they need to add better players. Defensive tackle was a need from a quantity standpoint because the Jets just didn't have any under contract other than Quinnen Williams. So they had to bring in some defensive tackles here. I figured they'd wait a little bit longer. I figured they'd, deal with the veterans, but it sounds like the Jets are going for some younger guys. The 2 guys they've signed, Kinlaw and Fatu, both guys who 4 years into their career. So Jets, again, going a little youth, which I can't complain about. It's something I wanted to see the Jets do last year, and they did not by any stretch of the imagination. But there still are some pretty glaring needs that remain for the New York Jets. And as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to turn our attention to what comes next. Jets have not been big spenders yet, but things could change pretty quickly. So who are some of the players they could target? Well, I'll give you some ideas continuing this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. You should not have to worry when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Game Time has so many benefits. You can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. You can buy tickets in seconds with 2 taps. I've used it myself. Really easy. Just pull out your phone or your device, couple taps, you got great seats, you got amazing prices. I've used it a lot, and I found some amazing deals on Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON. It's one word with no space, locked on for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. Free agency's gotten off to a bit of a slow start for the New York Jets. Their 2 core needs heading into the offseason were wide receiver and offensive line, and they really have not addressed either spot in a meaningful way. They did sign John Simpson, who has a great first name, by the way, but that's only one player. Jets entered this offseason needing 3 starters on the offensive line and probably 2 new receivers to start for them. They've gotten 1 offensive lineman so far. The good news is that there really has not been a ton of movement on either the offensive line or wide receivers markets. And that's especially true at the tackle position on the offensive line. So when I spent the first segment telling you to relax a little bit, that's part of the calculus. It kind of feels like the tackles out there and the wide receivers out there aren't seeing the money that they're looking for. They're not seeing the dollar signs that they want. So it could present an opportunity for the Jets to swoop in and get some guys on reasonable contracts. If you look at the wide receiver free agent group, Calvin Ridley at the time we are recording this podcast, and that can always change. One of the challenges about doing the podcast during free agency is that sometimes what you say has a very short shelf life. But as of the time we're recording this, Calvin Ridley is unsigned. And if you go beyond Calvin Ridley, there are other quality players available. A guy who really could make sense for the Jets, and I've gone back and forth on him, but I kind of now falling into the idea he'd be a logical fit. Tyler Boyd of the Bengals, a guy who's been one of the top number 3 receivers in the NFL. As of the time we're recording this, he's still available. He's been a guy who's been good in the slot, a bigger type slot receiver, a guy who could be could end up being a nice fit for the Jets as a complimentary guy, not a number 1 guy, but a nice complimentary player who could slide in behind Garrett Wilson and take a good share of the slot snaps. He could be a good addition. He's still out there. Hollywood Brown, I go back and forth on him. I feel like at the right price, he could be a good addition to add some speed to this team. But if the wide receiver market's not materializing, maybe there are going to be some deals to be had. And part of the reason guys sign the first day or two is that they get an offer that's so good, they get exactly the money that they're looking for, that they just say, you know what, we can't negotiate any better than this. We're just taking the deal. And that hasn't happened at the wide receiver position. And then at the tackle position, I mean, there are also guys available. Like, I'm not wild. If you're a long time listener to the show, I'm not wild about the idea of Tyron Smith, because he's always injured and he's in his 30s, but he did play 13 games last year. He is still playing at a really high level. He's still out there. I think the Jets are going to be able to get him. I mean, look, if I hear the Jets are negotiating with Tyron Smith, I'm going to be assuming that he's just using the Jets as leverage to try and get more money out of Dallas, but he's out there. Trent Brown still out there. I'm getting a guy I'm not wild about, but a guy who would be an upgrade if nothing else. Jonah Williams, not the greatest tackle in the world, but a guy who's got some versatility. He's played on both sides of the line, at least gives you a floor. There are guys who are available who are quality players. So, when I see the panic, look, I'll tell you when it's time to panic. If you're an everyday or if you listen to this show for a long time, that I'm not, I'll tell you exactly when you should panic. I'll tell you exactly when the Jets are doomed. But I'm here to tell you the Jets are not yet doomed. And that's part of the reason that I'm saying relax. I won't be relaxed if the Jets go out and sign some of the Green Bay guys. The only thing that, I just told, at the beginning of the show, I talked about why I wasn't super nervous about all this Rodgers news. The only thing I'm nervous about is if he's going to start using it as like leverage to say sign Bakhtiari or sign Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Like that's the stuff that would worry me. Like the thing that will make me very upset is if the Jets start bringing in Rodgers as friends who aren't very good player, or in Bakhtiari's case, he's a very good player, but he just is his body's breaking down. That's the point where I would have an issue with what the Jets are doing. But at this point, I actually kind of like what Joe Douglas is doing. And I've been very critical of Joe Douglas. I think he's deserved a lot of the criticism, but this is the opposite of the approach he took last year. He actually is giving himself a chance to make some pretty good signing. Now, will he do it? I mean, we've talked about this a lot with Joe Douglas, how sometimes the method, sometimes the process is pretty decent, but the results aren't there because he doesn't execute at a very high level. But I think looking at this situation, there's a chance for the Jets to actually come out ahead this offseason. And my biggest concerns heading into the offseason were that they were going to be too aggressive, that Douglas was going to realize his job was on the line and just give out a bunch of crazy contracts and destroy the Jets' future. And he hasn't done that so far. You've actually seen much more reasoned, a much more nuanced approach from Joe Douglas. Kind of reminds me from the Joe Douglas the first couple of years, where it felt like he kind of had the Jets moving in the right direction, before all the craziness from a year ago. So we'll see what happens. I mean, look, I'm not here to tell you I'm super optimistic about the New York Jets right now, but I also think a lot of the pessimism is not I think a lot of the pessimism of the last 2 days is not merited. I think the Jets' issues are that they have a lot of needs to fill and not a lot of resources. It's not that they've struck out on some random free agent who got a ridiculous contract. Jets at least have a shot right now to get this right. Let's hope they do. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.